Once there was a man who had run out of time. His name was Elf, and he was in a hospice bed holding the hand of his wife, Liz, who looked so much older than he remembered her. And there was her best friend, and she looked aged too, and he didn't even recognize the other people around the bed, even though he knew he should. In fact, he didn't remember anything of his life at all. And his wife, to whom he said these things, looked down at him with such love and sadness and longing. When into the room stepped a Sheikh. He was dressed all in white, apart from the gold and black braid around his headscarf. He bowed low and said, "Forgive my intrusion. At such a fragile time, I have a gift for you." In his hand, he had a blue velvet sheath, out of which he pulled a glass vial much like a test tube, and inside of it there were 7 layers of coloured sand, which glistened as though they were diamonds in amongst the grains. The sands of time. 7 layers for 7 lives. 7 wives? Said Elf. I didn't have 7 wives, did I? And he looked to his wife. No. 7 lives, said the Sheikh. Oh, right, said Elf. St. Ives. That explains the get-up. Is it Christmas? I didn't bring you gifts. And he looked to Liz for help again. Seeing his mistake, the Sheikh apologized, said he'd come at the wrong time, bowed low and left, and was gone just as quickly as he'd come. He got all the way to the lobby when Liz caught up with him and said, "I'm sorry, it's just that..." "The fault is all mine," said the Sheikh. And then by way of introduction, he said that his name was not important. All that matters was that many years ago, he'd commissioned a ship to be built, and he'd visited it in the Manchester docks, where he'd met a young ship's carpenter who had so much energy, the same energy with which he put into playing banjo on the night before the Sheikh left to go home. And to his wonder, many years later, that same ship's carpenter, who was now in the Air Force, saved the Sheikh's life. The Sheikh had said at the time to Elf he wanted to repay him but didn't have the means. As a token of his future wealth with which he could pay him, he handed over a bottle with crude oil inside. But Elf and his family had moved far away, and the Sheikh had never got to repay him until now. Once again, he slipped out that glass vial and he handed it over to Liz. The sands of time. These are the sands from the magical island of Arzana in the Persian Gulf near my home in Abu Dhabi. And then he explained how each layer of sand could take her back to one of Elf's 7 lives. "But we only have one life," said Liz. "Perhaps, but I think you will agree with me that between birth and death, we live many different lives." The Sheikh explained how to use those sands, that each one would take her back to one of Elf's memories, and when she was there, she must retrieve an item, something that was special to him or that he knew was special to her. And when she got 7 items, she could place them on the bed in front of him. And in his final moments, he would remember everything. "This is the only way I can save his life, by giving it back to him," said the Sheikh. And then he bowed and left. And Liz walked back to the room and stood in the doorway, looking at her husband there in the bed, and her daughters beside with their husbands and their children, and at her best friend Pearl, and at the few members of her husband's folk band. And it was all she could do to wish for anything. She pulled out the cork and she emptied from the glass vial carefully 1 layer of sand into her palm and blew. There was a whirlwind of sand that dumped her down onto grass. She was on the lawn of her best friend's childhood home, and there was Elf on the grass, fixing the cart that his granddad had made, the one he boasted about for the rest of his life. And you could hear the old man upstairs, playing violin, practicing for the Halley Orchestra. And then down the garden path, there came Pearl, holding her favourite doll. Liz knew it wasn't the one she really wanted. She wanted one of those diner dolls, or one of those fancy slim tressy dolls with a lever in the back of the head that she could pull and make the hair grow. But her reverie was broken when she realised why she'd come, and she looked around thinking what could she take back to the present when she saw through the open garage door, on a shelf, one of the knotted rope weights that her husband made. She went right over and was just about to take one from the shelf when she heard a voice behind her. "Can I help you, miss?" It was Pearl's mum, who Liz was scared of even to this day. She quickly reached out and grabbed a knotted weight. She was back. In the hospice room, in one hand the opened vial of sand, in the other hand the knotted weight. She looked into the room and nothing had changed. Quickly, she stashed away that weight into her knitted bag. And then she looked over at her husband. Times had been tough on everyone in the 50s. How her own parents hadn't even been able to afford for dance lessons for her, but how she and Alf had paid for their daughter's dance lessons so that now she was a ballet teacher, and how they'd imbued such freedom in their other daughter that now she was a Reiki master and walked barefoot on the earth. She was so proud of her husband. She took one more layer of sand, tipped it onto her hand, and blew. The sand set her down on a train. She was in her nurse's outfit. She'd only ever done that once, so she knew exactly when and where she was. It was 1967, and she was on her way to Anglesey to join Pearl and her family on their holiday. She felt underneath her cap, and sure enough, there were the curlers still in place. She took off her cap and unfurled her hair, and as the curls rolled down, she smiled to herself how for 57 years she'd keep the secret even from her best friend that her hair wasn't really curly. Then, taking out a skirt from her bag, she squeezed that on, pulled on some tights. She put on some lipstick, and looking in the compact mirror, she thought, and not for the first time, "I wonder if Charles will have me now." And then she smiled and started singing one of her favourite Searchers songs. "Sweets for my sweets, sugar for my honey," as the train rolled on towards Anglesey. When she got there, she stepped up next to Pearl, who accepted her arrival as the most common thing. And then Liz looked on stage, as there, a strapping lad now in the Merchant Navy, was Alf playing the banjo with gusto. Suddenly she felt nervous, just as she had on that very day, and it took 2 knee-knocker ciders for her to have the courage to even speak to him. When he walked over, she was so tipsy she tousled his hair, and he didn't fix it. He just said, "Does the Ken Dodd look good on me?" And she said, "Yes." "Well, how tickled I am," he said. And then Liz tickled him and ran out the door. He gave chase and found her round the side of the hotel, leaning, laughing for breathing. And he walked over slowly, looking at her as though he saw her beauty for the very first time. Then he lifted up the banjo as though it was a violin, and he sang, "Love is like a violin." "He talks too much, that man," he said. "Well, I don't," said Liz, and she took hold of the banjo, and she leant in, and Alf kissed her. And there she was in the hospice, leaning against the doorframe with the banjo in her hand, still tasting that kiss that changed it all on her lips. She carefully leant the banjo against the wall, and then she remembered how days after that kiss, Alf had come to visit her family homestead, and he'd marvelled that there was no running water, and then rambled on about how the copper boiler electrified the water, and reaching out for a hand, there was an electric shock, and they laughed, and they tumbled and tickled in the hay until he looked at her, seriously, and he asked if she would marry him. She said yes, of course. She was doing her training down at Hampstead Hospital, and when she had 2 weeks coming up for holiday, she asked the administration if she could take that time to get married. But they said no. When she told her fiancé, Alf said, "Well, that settles it then. We're definitely getting married." And so they did. He was working at BBC Wood Norton, and on his desk he placed a note that said, "Normal service will be resumed after I get back from honeymoon." And they were married. In St. Lawrence Church, the family and friends did everything from the flowers to the organ to the cake. And Liz, she made the dresses too, and it was perfect, just as their honeymoon was in Nevada. And then a year later, when she was in labour and Alf was working all night long at the BBC for the moon landing, he was too late to see the birth, but when he came by, and lifted up their first daughter and kissed her wrinkled head. He looked at his wife. And then he announced to the whole ward, "You know, the whole night I was thinking about those pilots flying up there in their spacecraft, and I was thinking how I want to do that. And I want my children to grow up, and I want them to see that I've lived my dreams. You know, I'm sick of seeing amazing places on the telly. I'm going to take my family to see them. We're going to see the world. I'm going to join the Air Force." And he did. He always did the things that he said. Liz took that vial and lowered another layer of sand onto her hand and blew. The sandstorm blew her onto a road to the sound of gunshots. She had her daughter in her hand and she looked around in confusion and wondered where she was. She was in Famagusta, Cyprus, and there were Greeks and Turks shouting and fighting and shooting, and up ahead there was a husband with her other daughter in hand shouting, "Run, run!" She started to run, and her daughter, through the madness, was shouting, "Mummy, please don't let it go of the woods." And Liz looked down, and in her hand there was a branch of olive wood, and she held onto it now like a talisman of hope that they would survive that day. She was back in the hospice, holding on to that olive wood and seeing that her family was safe. She slipped the wood into her bag, and she was really getting the hang of this now. She tipped another layer of sand into her hand and blew. The sands of time lowered her gently onto a cold stone floor in their flat in Abu Dhabi. It was flat 3, and she remembered how her daughter would say, "Flat flea." And then she looked over and smiled at the pile of Women's Weekly, her lifeline to the outside world where they didn't even have a telly, and she longed to watch Wimbledon. But it was a good life that they were living. She had time to make dresses for herself and her husband, and she had even done the difficult task of reupholstering their furniture, and it felt good. And her husband was happy. Alf had taken to running competitively. He'd even gone all the way to Australia to run. And then she saw it. There on the shelf, that bottle of crude oil that meant so much more to her now. She got up, she reached out and she took it. Back in the hospice room, she carefully placed that oil into a hat her friend had made her and back into her bag. And then, taking another layer of sand into her palm, she lifted it and blew. She was blown with the sands onto the streets of Offanen, the Queen's Silver Jubilee, and in front of her was a table upon which there was the huge cake that she and Pearl had made. And there was Pearl, dancing with the Morris dancers, stomping away. She had so much love for that friend of hers, who'd become so much more to her, like family. Even more than family when Pearl had joined her husband's band, playing the tambourine. And just like that, Liz was back in the hospice, holding that tambourine which jingled. Pearl looked up from the bed, and her eyes said, "What's going on?" She came over, and Liz explained that she'd been on a journey down memory lane of sorts, and then she turned to her friend and said, "Pearl, would you go anywhere with me?" "I'd go to the moon and back," said Pearl. "Thought so." Carefully, Liz placed the tambourine down, then took her friend's hand and dipped some sand into her palm and blew. The sand flung them down quite comfortably onto the sofa of her living room. In front of them on the telly was Prince Charles and Diana's wedding, and next to her, Pearl was sitting with a look of absolute amazement. In return, Liz just smiled a smile that said, "I know. Crazy, right?" But then they were caught up in the wedding, and there was Di getting out of the car, and Pearl said, "Do you remember that? Her dress was all creased. Serves her right." Liz said, "No, I got the best of them, I did." And then she looked up on a shelf and saw a commemorative tin that Alf had bought her at Owen & Owen in Evesham. And she stood up, and she grabbed that tin, and she was back with Pearl in the hospice room. And Pearl was smiling such a mischievous smile as she went and sat back down by the bed, gave a wink to Liz, and then Liz put the tin in her bag and looked at the vial. There was only one layer left. She took a deep breath, poured that last layer into her palm, and blew. Now she was upon the sand, in St. Ives, and on her lap there was a photo album. And in the album were all the memories that they'd had in St. Ives. All those Christmas holidays when they'd got dressed up, the Boxing Day dips in the freezing cold water, building sandcastles that withstood the waves. And suddenly Liz knew that all the memories of her husband were safe within her heart. And when she stood back in the hospice room, she knew she was ready. She walked over to the bed and placed the album down, put the other items down upon the bed, and he looked at each one. And when he got to the last one, Alf looked up at her, and those eyes that had glazed over suddenly became their same old Baltic blue, and Liz knew that he remembered everything. And most of all, she saw that Alf knew that he would be remembered too.